Welcome to Episode 7, where we delve into Section 6 of Friedrich Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, exploring Rome's transition from a kinship-based gens society to a structured state.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating part of the story. We're looking at how ancient Rome fundamentally shifted.
Right. Moving away from a society basically defined by who you were related to, blood ties, clans.
And towards one built much more on, well, territory and wealth.
Well,
What you owned, where you lived.
it's kind of like looking at the ancient DNA of modern political structures, seeing how those factors started to overshadow lineage.
Exactly. And we're using Engels's text here, specifically Section 6, as our guide. Our goal is to really unpack what that early Roman gens was like.
What were its key features?
Yeah, and how the bigger picture, the curiae, the tribes, were supposedly built on it. Then we'll get into the challenges Rome faced as it, grew and changed.
And that leads to the big one, this revolutionary shift that created a state based on totally different ideas.
Which really set the stage for Rome, as we often think of it.
So, get ready to look under the hood of ancient power. We're exploring how wealth and land ownership kind of elbowed blood ties out of the way as the defining thing in society.
Let's dive in. Okay, so the legends, the founding stories of Rome. They talk about three tribes.
Right. The Ramnes, Tides, and Luceris,
Yeah.
supposedly.
And each of these tribes was said to have 100 gents, these kinship groups. And then the gents were bundled into groups of 10 to form a curia.
Giving you 30 curia in total.
Exactly. But the source we're using, Engels, is pretty quick to suggest these tribes were probably, let's say, artificial constructions later on.
Maybe built around some older core elements, but not quite the neat structure the legend suggests.
Right. The gens itself, though, that seems to be seen as the more authentic fundamental unit, something left over from a really early primitive structure.
And this Roman gens, the source draws a direct line to the Greek gens, doesn't it?
It does. Says it's essentially the same institution.
Yep.
And interestingly, connects it back even further to the basic social unit found among, say, indigenous peoples in North America.
The text specifically mentions the Iroquois.
Yeah, the Iroquois shows through unmistakably. It really highlights how fundamental this kind of kinship organization might have been in early human societies across the globe.
Okay, so let's pin down what this Roman gens actually was, what defined it. The source lists quite a few characteristics.
Yeah, several key things. Let's start with property. A big one was the mutual right of inheritance among members of the gens, the Gentiles.
So the property, the wealth, stayed within the group.
Pretty much. Now, Rome had shifted to father right, so inheritance typically followed the male line. Descendants through the female line were usually excluded from inheriting within that specific gens.
Okay.
And the old law of the 12 tables kind of reflects this. It lays out the order. First the children, then the agnates relatives through the male line, and only then, if there were none, the Gentiles, the rest of the clan.
But the key thing is, it always stayed within the gens structure, one way or another.
Exactly. It shows this blend of older, custom-keeping property in the clan, but also new legal ideas influenced by wealth and monogamy starting to shape things.
Got it. So group wealth was maintained. What else defined the gens?
Well, socially and religiously, they had shared elements, like a common burial place.
Oh, interesting. Like a family plot, but for the whole clan.
Sort of, yeah. The source mentions the Claudi gens, when they supposedly immigrated, being given land and a common burial spot. And even way later, in Augustus's time, you hear about Varus's head being brought back to be buried in his gens burial place.
A real marker of belonging, even after death.
Definitely. And they had common religious rites, too, the Sacra Gentilitia, specific ceremonies for the clan.
Okay, so shared land, shared gods, shared ancestors. What about marriage?
Ah, yes. The obligation not to marry within your own gens.
Exogamy.
Marrying out.
Right. Now, this apparently wasn't ever written down as formal law in Rome. But the evidence points that way, like spouses generally didn't share the same Gentile name.
That makes sense. And inheritance rules support it, too. When a woman married, she effectively left her birth gens, losing her inheritance rights there and likely joining her husband's.
So you keep the wealth consolidated by inheriting within the group, but you build alliances by marrying outside the group. Kind of a balancing act.
That's a good way to put it. Then there's the idea of common land. Originally, the gens probably held land collectively.
Alongside maybe tribal land or individual family plots.
Yeah, even after legends about figures like Romulus giving out small individual plots like 2.5 acres, the story goes this gens ownership of land seems to have continued alongside state land for quite some time.
Okay. What else?
There was also an obligation of mutual protection and help. The clan sticks together.
A safety net.
Exactly. Though the source does note this became less critical, maybe even vestigial, as the Roman state itself grew more powerful and took over those protective functions.
So the state started providing the security the clan used to.
Right. You see glimpses of the old way, like when Appius Claudius was arrested, his whole gens went into mourning. Or during the Punic Wars, when gentes tried to ransom their captured members, but the Senate actually stepped in and forbade it.
Interesting. The state asserting its authority over the clan.
Definitely a sign of the times changing. But some things persisted. The right to bear the Gentile name, that lasted. It was a clear sign of who you were, which group you belonged to.
Like a surname, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Even freedmen, former slaves, could often use their ex-master's Gentile name, showing a connection, though they didn't get the full rights of a gentilis.
Okay. And could they bring outsiders in?
Yes, the right to adopt strangers into the gens. Usually it seems this happened through adoption into a specific family first, which then led to acceptance by the whole gens.
A controlled way to grow the group or bring in useful people, maybe?
Perhaps. And finally, governance. How is this gens run?
Was there a chief?
The source talks about a princeps, a chief. It infers a right for the gens members to elect or even depose this chief, although it's not explicitly spelled out for the gens level quite as clearly as for, say, the king or the priests of the Curiae.
But the practice of election existed at other levels in early Rome.
Yes, the king and curia priests were elected, so the idea was likely there for the gens too, even if, in practice, leadership might have tended to stay within the same family line over generations.
Okay, so if you put all that together, shared inheritance, land, burial, religion, marrying out, helping each other, a common name, adoption, some form of leadership, you really get a picture of this foundational social unit.
Absolutely. A kinship group with clear rights, duties, and a strong sense of identity. And what's striking, as Engels points out, is how closely these features, despite some evolution like the shift to father right, mirror those found in other societies organized around the gens concept.
It suggests a kind of common pattern in early social organization.
It really does.
Now, speaking of how the gens worked internally, the source dives into a bit of a historical debate, doesn't it? About marriage rules.
Yes, specifically whether the Roman gens was endogamous members, had to marry within the group, or exogamous, marrying outside, which we just discussed, seems likely.
And there was a particular historian, Mommsen, who argued for endogamy.
That's right. And his main evidence was, believe it or not, based on a single passage from the historian Livy.
Okay, let's unpack that. Livy, Book 39, Chapter 19. It's about a freedwoman, right? Ficinia Hispala.
Correct. And there's a Senate decree about her. It grants her various rights, saying they're given as if granted to her by her deceased husband's will.
And what were these rights?
Key among them was something called a nuptio gentis, literally the right to marry outside the gens. It also gave her the right to choose her own guardian, and said she could marry a freeman without him facing any disadvantage.
Okay, so Mommsen sees this phrase, a nuptio gentis, right to marry outside the gens, and concludes
that if she needed special permission to marry outside, then the default, the normal rule, must have been marrying inside. Endogamy.
Makes a certain kind of surface-level sense, I guess, but the source, Engels, really pushes back on this.
Strongly. First off, he says, look, this contradicts what we see in basically all other comparable societies, where the gens structure points towards exogamy.
Okay, the comparative evidence. What else?
The internal logic. Let's think it through. If the gens really was endogamous, both men and women would have to marry inside it. So the idea that a husband could grant his wife the right to marry outside the very gens that he himself belongs to.
And that she's supposedly bound to stay within.
It just seems like a legal and social absurdity within that framework. Why would he have the power to let her leave his group via marriage if that wasn't something she could normally do anyway? And then consider the alternative. What if she married outside her birth gens, but somehow magically remained a member of it? Then the idea of her husband granting her permission to leave her birth gens is even weirder, because he doesn't belong to her original clan. He has no say there.
Okay, so what's the interpretation Engels favors, following Lewis Henry Morgan?
The only one that really makes sense, according to them, is that the woman, upon marriage, left her birth gens and entered her husband's gens. She became part of his group.
Right, joined his clan.
Exactly. Now, if she's part of his gens, then after his death, especially with property involved, which, remember, was supposed to stay in the gens, she might normally be expected to remarry within his gens to keep things tidy.
Okay, so then it makes sense.
Then it makes perfect sense that he, her first husband, the one who brought her into his clan, would be the one who could grant her special permission, maybe in his will, to leave his gens by marrying someone outside that group after he died.
So this interpretation actually supports the original exogamous nature of the gens marrying out of your birth gens was normal, but marrying out of your husband's gens after joining it might require special allowance.
Precisely. It flips Mommsen's argument on its head based on a more logical reading of the social dynamics.
That does clear it up considerably.
And the source throws in one more possibility, too. Maybe, just maybe, this whole annuptio gentis thing only applied to freed women, like Ficinia Hispala. Maybe they had unique legal restrictions. And this passage tells us absolutely nothing about marriage rules for freeborn Roman women, the ingenue.
Interesting. So either way you look at it.
The idea that the Roman gens was endogamous, based solely on this one tricky passage, seems pretty shaky according to Engels. The weight of evidence, both comparative and logical, points towards women marrying outside their birth gens and joining their husbands.
It's a good case study in how you need context and comparison to interpret specific historical details.
Absolutely. You can't just take one line in isolation.
Okay, so while these internal structures and debates were part of the picture, Rome itself wasn't standing still. It was growing. Fast.
Massively. Through immigration, yes, but also significantly through conquest. Conquering and absorbing surrounding peoples.
And this brought in a whole new population segment.
Exactly. A large, growing number of new residents who were personally free. They could own land, own property, they paid taxes, they served in the military.
But crucially, they weren't part of the original gang. They weren't members of the old gentes, curiae, and tribes.
Correct. They were the plebeians, or plebs. They stood outside that old kinship-based structure of the populus Romanus, the original Roman people.
And what was their position? They contribute, but...
They were shut out of power. They couldn't hold political office. They couldn't participate in the old assembly, the Comitia Curiata, which was based on those kinship groups. And they didn't get a share of the conquered state lands that the original populace benefited from.
So you've got this growing group, contributing taxes, fighting in the army.
Getting military training in arms.
Some of them becoming quite wealthy through trade or industry or owning land.
Yes. The source emphasizes that wealth wasn't just limited to the old patrician families. There was significant wealth among the plebs, too.
But they're completely excluded from political power and the spoils of war by the old guard, the populace, who were apparently quite rigid about keeping them out.
That sounds like a recipe for serious tension.
It was. The source identifies this fundamental conflict, the struggle between the increasingly numerous, armed, and often wealthy plebs and the exclusive old populace as the driving force behind what it calls a revolution.
A major shift in the system.
And this led to a whole new constitution, didn't it? Traditionally pinned on the king Servius Tullius.
Yes, and Engels explicitly compares it to the reforms of Solon in Athens. It was revolutionary because it created a new main assembly.
One that included everybody.
Well, it included both the old populace and the new plebeians. But crucially, membership and power in this new assembly weren't based on blood ties at all.
So what was it based on?
Two things: liability for military service, and most importantly, property ownership. Wealth.
Ah, so money talks.
Loudly. The entire free male population who were eligible for military duty was divided into 6 classes, purely based on the assessed value of their property, measured in asses.
Okay, 6 property classes. How did that translate into political power in this new assembly?
This new assembly was called the Comitia Centuriata, the Assembly of the Centuries. The citizens were grouped into centuries, supposedly companies of 100 men, although the numbers probably became symbolic, and each century got 1 vote.
Okay, 1 century, 1 vote. But how are the centuries distributed among the classes?
That's the crucial part. The first class, the wealthiest, those with over 100,000 asses, they were assigned 80 centuries.
80 votes just for the top class.
Plus, the absolute wealthiest, who could afford horses and served in the cavalry, they got another 18 centuries.
Okay, so that's 98 centuries just between the cavalry and the first class. What about the others?
Classes 2, 3, 4, and 5 had progressively lower property requirements. 75,000, 50,000, 25,000, and 11,000 asses, respectively. And they got fewer centuries each. I think it was 20, 20, 20, and 30 centuries for those classes. Oh, wait, the source says 22, 20, 22, 30. Doesn't change the core point much, though.
And the poorest?
Yeah, class 6. Those below the minimum threshold, under 11,000 asses, called proletarians, because their contribution was seen as providing children, Proles, they were mostly exempt from military service and taxes. And they were all lumped together into just one single century.
One vote for the entire bottom group.
Right. Now, add up all the centuries. 18 plus 80 plus 22 plus 20 plus 22 plus 30 plus 1. That's 193 centuries in total.
Okay, 193 total votes. But wait, the cavalry plus the first class, you said that was 98 votes.
Exactly. And how many votes do you need for a majority out of 193?
97.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So if the cavalry in the first class, the absolute wealthiest citizens, agreed on something.
They had 98 votes, more than enough. They could decide the outcome without even asking the other four classes, let alone the proletarians.
That's the genius, or perhaps the cynicism, of the system, as presented here. It created a new public assembly that looked inclusive, bringing in the plebs. But it was structurally engineered so that political power rested overwhelmingly with the wealthiest property owners.
Economic power became political power, formalized.
Directly translated, a massive departure from the old kinship system.
So what happened to the old structures, the comitia curiata, the gentes?
They were pushed aside. The new comitia centuriata took over the main political functions. The old assembly, based on curiae and gentes, faded, becoming mostly concerned with private matters, religious formalities. Like the Greek phratries after Solon, they became sort of dormant vestigial organs.
And the original tribes based on kinship.
Also superseded for political purposes.
Yeah.
4 new local tribes were created based on geographical districts within the city. And these territorial tribes were the ones that held political rights going forward.
So territory replaced blood there, too.
Absolutely. The source is really emphatic on this point. In Rome, and this is key, even before they got rid of the kings, this ancient social order based on personal blood ties, the gens system, was fundamentally broken.
Destroyed, it says.
Destroyed, yes.
Yeah.
And replaced by a new state constitution based on territorial division and, crucially, differences in wealth. Public power now belonged to those liable for military service, defined by their property, standing in opposition to both slaves and the propertyless proletarians.
That is a profound transformation. The very basis of society and power redefined.
It really is. And the source then briefly traces where this led.
Right after the last king was kicked out.
The Republic began with 2 consuls replacing the king, but operating within this new Servian constitutional framework.
And the history of the Republic then was shaped by this new reality.
Very much so. The ongoing struggles between the old patricians and the plebeians continued, fighting over access to office, distribution of land. But eventually, the source argues, the old nobility kind of merged with the wealthiest plebeians.
Forming a new elite.
A new nobility, yeah, based primarily on wealth, large land holdings, and money.
And this new wealthy class, how did they operate?
According to the source, they systematically accumulated vast amounts of land, often buying it cheap or taking it from small peasant farmers who were ruined, frequently by being away on long military campaigns.
The very military service demanded by the state.
It could lead to the soldiers losing their land back home.
Yeah.
And these huge consolidated estates, the latifundia, were then worked mostly by slave labor.
Which had another consequence, right?
Yes, the depopulation of the Italian countryside, as the free peasantry was squeezed out and replaced by slaves on these massive estates, a major internal weakness.
And Engels draws a direct line from this internal situation.
Stemming directly from that foundational shift away from kinship towards wealth and territory.
To Rome's later trajectory.
He argues this state of affairs, this hollowing out of the free population and concentration of wealth, threw open the door not only to the emperors, but also to their successors, the German barbarians.
Wow. So he's linking the very structure established by the Servian constitution, prioritizing wealth and territory, to the eventual decline and transformation of Rome centuries later.
It's a powerful argument about how the fundamental organizing principles of a society can shape its entire historical path, its rise and its fall. That decision way back to base power on property rather than peoplehood through kinship.
Set Rome on a course that led to empire, yes, but also to internal contradictions, inequality, depopulation that ultimately made it vulnerable.
It certainly makes you think about the foundation.
It really does. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. What does this ancient Roman story tell us about how societies are built? When political power and social structure become tied primarily to wealth and territory, as opposed to, say, kinship or other forms of belonging, what are the long-term consequences?
How do those ancient patterns resonate, or maybe differ from the systems we navigate today?
Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a really pivotal moment. Rome's shift from a world centered on the family clan to one centered on the state. defined by property in place.
It's a transformation that echoed far beyond Rome itself, shaping so much of subsequent political thought and development.
Absolutely. Until next time.